Sophie sat alone in her living room, the warm glow of the lamp contrasting sharply with the cold weight in her chest. She stared at her phone screen, the photo of her husband, Tom, and her best friend, Emily, smiling together on a beach in Bali. The caption read, "Our first vacation together. So in love." The words blurred before her eyes. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the phone, her mind racing. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a punch to her stomach. She had always trusted Emily, treated her like a sister. And Tom. Tom had been her rock, the person she thought would never hurt her. The tears stung her eyes, but Sophie didn't let them fall. Not yet. She was too numb, too angry. For the past few months, she had been sensing something wasn't right. Long hours at work, Tom's distracted behavior, Emily's strange silence. But this was the confirmation she had never wanted. Sophie spent the rest of the night staring at the photo, over and over, trying to make sense of it all. She felt as though she had been living in a dream, one where her life was perfect, and the people she trusted most were there to protect her. But now that dream had shattered. The silence in the house was deafening. She thought about confronting them, calling Tom, demanding an explanation. But as the night passed, something inside her shifted. The anger slowly morphed into something more dangerous, calm determination. She wasn't going to beg for answers, wasn't going to fall into their trap of lies and excuses. She had something they didn't see coming. She'd let them think everything was fine, that Sophie was weak and heartbroken. But she knew better now. She had been foolish, thinking Tom loved her, that Emily would never betray her. But she was smarter than that. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a blur. Sophie threw herself into work, keeping her mind busy, pushing the thoughts of Tom and Emily to the back of her mind. But every so often, the image of them together would flash in her thoughts, and the pain would come rushing back. She knew she couldn't let this go. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. Sophie had always been the kind of person who took care of things herself. She didn't need anyone to fight her battles. And this time, it was no different. She began to gather information, quietly, methodically. She checked their bank accounts, looking for inconsistencies, for any hint of what they had been hiding. It didn't take long before she found it. Emily had been buying expensive gifts for herself, gifts that Sophie had never seen before. It was clear now. Emily wasn't just her best friend. She had been using Sophie's trust to manipulate her way into Tom's life. Sophie didn't need to ask for confirmation anymore. She had the proof she needed. With a calm resolve, Sophie began to set her plan into motion. She knew she had to be careful. She couldn't confront them just yet. They would expect that. No, Sophie was smarter than that. She had been taking care of everything for so long, organizing their bills, managing the house finances, even paying off some of Tom's debts when he got behind. No one knew the full extent of Sophie's contributions, not even Tom. He thought it was just his money, his hard work. But Sophie had been handling it all. She started by slowly redirecting some of their joint accounts, setting up a new account that would be just for her. She made sure everything was legal, taking small, precise steps. She knew she would have to be patient. The right moment would come, and when it did, she would strike. By the time Tom returned from his trip with Emily, Sophie had everything in place. She had watched as the days passed, each one filled with more tension. Tom would call, text, asking if she wanted to talk, but Sophie simply ignored him. She was no longer interested in hearing his lies. She had already made up her mind. He would pay for what he did to her, and Emily. Emily would see how it felt to be the one left behind. The day after Tom returned, he came home early from work. Sophie had been waiting for this moment. As he walked through the door, he smiled and tried to act like everything was normal. But Sophie could see it in his eyes. Guilt. Fear. He knew she knew. but he had no idea what she had planned. Sophie remained calm, even when Tom apologized, claiming it was all a mistake, that he still loved her. He hadn't even mentioned Emily's name. Sophie didn't let the anger show. She didn't need to. She was in control now. When Tom sat down beside her, still trying to find the right words, Sophie simply took a deep breath and smiled, her eyes cold and calculating. "You know, Tom," she said slowly, "I've been thinking about everything. About how you've treated me. About how Emily has treated me. And I've realized something important. You're both so good at pretending, aren't you? Pretending like nothing has changed, pretending that I don't know what's been going on." Tom looked confused, but Sophie could see him tense, his jaw clenching. He was about to speak, but she cut him off. "Don't bother apologizing. It's too late for that." Sophie stood up, walked over to the desk, and pulled out the documents she had carefully arranged. She laid them out in front of Tom. "These are the papers for our house, the ones you've never bothered to read. And this," she said, sliding a new document across the table, "is a contract you'll need to sign. Because as of today, this house is mine. I've been the one paying off everything. All these years, I've been the one keeping things afloat. And you never knew." Tom's face drained of color. Sophie could see the realization hitting him. "You're not the victim here, Tom. I've been carrying you all along, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." As Sophie handed him the paperwork, she watched as his hands shook. "You think you can just leave me for her? For Emily? You think you can betray me like this and get away with it? Well, guess what, Tom? You've lost more than just me." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You've lost everything. And when Emily finds out what's really been going on, she'll realize she's not going to win this one either." Tom was silent, unable to speak. Sophie wasn't done yet. She had everything planned out. Emily's deceit would be exposed soon enough, and there would be no turning back for either of them. Sophie had made sure of it. Sophie could see the panic in Tom's eyes now, the realization of everything he had taken for granted crashing down around him. He sat there, frozen, unable to comprehend the mess he had walked into. She stood there, her posture straight, her mind as clear as it had ever been. The anger from the betrayal was still there, but it had transformed into something else now. Satisfaction, power. For once, she was in control of her own fate. She had been the one to support Tom, to make sure their lives ran smoothly, all while he took her for granted. Now, the tables had turned. She could hear his voice shaking as he finally spoke. "Sophie, please, But she cut him off, her voice calm and steady. "Don't bother, Tom. We're done. You can't undo what you've done." There was no more room for negotiation, no more room for apologies. He had destroyed whatever trust was left between them, and Sophie was finished pretending it didn't matter. His face twisted in disbelief. He was desperate, but it was too late for that. "What do you want from me, Sophie?" he asked, his voice cracking. She didn't hesitate, standing tall and looking him dead in the eyes. "I want you to sign those papers, and I want you out. I've already made arrangements. You have a week to pack your things and go." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Tom's face went pale, and he stood up, pacing around the room. "This isn't fair, Sophie. You're overreacting. Emily and we didn't mean for this to happen. You can't just take everything." Sophie's lips curled into a slight, cold smile. "You're right, Tom. It's not fair, but you'll have to deal with it, just like I've had to deal with your lies. I never asked you to choose her over me, but now you've forced me to make this decision." She felt a flicker of triumph when she saw him falter. Tom had always been the one with control, always the one who called the shots. But now, as she watched him desperately try to salvage his pride, Sophie could see that he was losing everything. He looked down at the papers, his fingers hovering over them. Are you really going to do this? Are you really going to let me go just like that? Sophie's voice didn't waver. Yes. And when you're gone, you'll see that everything you thought you could take from me isn't worth it. You won't have Emily, and you won't have me. You'll have nothing. Tom's breathing became shallow as the reality of the situation sank in. For the first time, Sophie saw the full extent of his regret. But it wasn't enough. Nothing he said could undo the damage he had done. Sophie watched him stand there, the weight of his choices settling on him like a stone. He tried once more to reason with her, to offer a glimmer of hope. But Sophie had already made up her mind. There was no going back now. I want this to be clean, Tom, she said. Sign the papers, pack your things, and leave. There's no more to talk about. Sophie didn't stay to watch him crumble. She walked away, her heart calm and steady, the anger slowly fading into a quiet satisfaction. She had gotten what she wanted. She had taken control of her life, her future, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her again. She knew Tom would try to fight, that he might even try to reach out to Emily, but she had made sure to cover her bases. She had already made arrangements for everything. Emily would soon find out that her betrayal had a price, and Sophie would be there to collect. Sophie wasn't angry anymore. She was ready. Ready for the next chapter of her life, one that didn't include Tom or Emily. They had made their choices, and now Sophie was going to make hers. She was going to move forward, stronger than ever, and no one could take that away from her. By the time Tom left the house, the anger had been replaced with a quiet sense of peace. Sophie knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she had done the right thing. She would never let herself be a victim again. The house that had once been a symbol of their life together now felt like a weight lifted from her shoulders. It was her house now. As she sat in the quiet living room, Sophie allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't just about the house, or the money, or even the revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, her power. The family, the life she had worked so hard to build, was finally hers again. And for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt free. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Sophie. Tom's departure had left a strange emptiness in the house, but it wasn't the same kind of emptiness she had feared. There was no sadness, no sense of loss, only the quiet hum of a new beginning. She had taken control, and now the world seemed to open up before her, full of possibilities she had long forgotten. The days were spent reorganizing her life, not just in terms of logistics, but emotionally as well. Sophie knew that the hardest part wasn't over. The true consequences of Tom and Emily's actions were still to come. She could feel it, an impending storm she had carefully orchestrated. She'd been silent, letting Tom think everything would blow over. He didn't realize just how much Sophie had been keeping from him. While he had tried to make it seem like they could pick up the pieces of their relationship, Sophie had been laying the groundwork for his downfall. She had been in touch with Emily's co-workers, subtly planting seeds of doubt, showing them the truth about her manipulations. Emily, so smug in her newfound relationship with Tom, had no idea Sophie was a few steps ahead. Every call, every message, every interaction had been recorded, each moment bringing Sophie closer to the ultimate truth. She wasn't just taking her life back, she was taking theirs as well. Sophie's phone buzzed one evening, the screen lighting up with a message from Emily. It was a simple, almost polite message. "Can we talk? I know this is hard, but I never meant to hurt you." Sophie's lips curled into a knowing smile. Emily had no idea what was coming. Sophie had heard it all before, the apologies, the guilt trips, the pleas for forgiveness. But this time, Sophie wasn't falling for it. She wasn't the weak woman who had cried herself to sleep for nights after discovering the affair. No. Now Sophie was strong, and she was ready. She could feel the thrill of justice creeping up her spine. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, She took a moment to savor the silence, to let Emily stew in her own guilt. The following day, Sophie met with her lawyer, Kate, who had been instrumental in setting up the legal side of things. Sophie was prepared for the fallout, but she was also ready to ensure there was no turning back for either Tom or Emily. Kate handed her a stack of documents, proof of Emily's actions, her financial manipulations, the attempts to smear Sophie's reputation, and most importantly, the evidence Sophie had carefully gathered about the affair. The evidence wasn't just damaging, it was damning. Emily's career, once thriving, would take a massive hit if this got out. Sophie had made sure of that. As Kate explained the next steps, Sophie felt a strange sense of relief. Everything was in place now, and the plan was set. All she had to do was wait for the right moment. That moment came sooner than she expected. Emily called her the next day, her voice soft but desperate. "Sophie, I know you're angry, but I never wanted it to be like this. I made a mistake. I was weak, and I'm so sorry." Sophie could hear the tremor in Emily's voice, but it did nothing to sway her. She had no sympathy left for the woman who had betrayed her trust. "Emily, I'm not angry anymore," Sophie replied coolly. "I'm done with the games, and I'm done with you. You don't get to apologize your way out of this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sophie could practically hear Emily trying to collect herself, trying to figure out how to spin her next words. "What do you mean?" Emily finally asked, her voice quieter now. Sophie leaned back in her chair, enjoying the moment. "What I mean is that your apology is meaningless. The damage has been done, and now I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Emily's breath hitched. Sophie didn't need to say more. Emily knew exactly what Sophie meant. Sophie hung up without another word, her heart pounding with a sense of satisfaction. It was time. Emily would have nowhere to hide, no way to spin the situation. Sophie had the upper hand now, and she intended to make sure everyone around her knew it. Tom would eventually come crawling back, trying to salvage what was left of his pride, but it would be too late. Sophie had made sure he wouldn't get away with it. She was not just moving on from her marriage, she was reclaiming her life, her power, and her dignity. Later that evening, Sophie sat at her kitchen table, her mind racing as she typed up an email. It was a simple one, but the words were calculated and sharp. She attached the documents she had collected over the past few weeks, evidence of Emily's affair with Tom, proof of her financial deceit, and screenshots of their communications. She addressed the email to a few key people: Emily's boss, her closest colleagues, and a few mutual friends who had no idea about the affair. Sophie hit send and sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. There was no going back now. She had exposed the truth, and the consequences were inevitable. The next morning, Sophie woke up to an email from her lawyer. It was all happening. Emily's boss had already scheduled a meeting with her, and a few colleagues had reached out to apologize for what they hadn't known. As Sophie read the messages, a sense of calm settled over her. The storm she had set into motion was already causing ripples. Emily had underestimated Sophie's resolve, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. Sophie didn't feel guilt or regret. She had been betrayed by the people she had trusted the most, and now it was time for them to face reality. They had lost their chance for redemption. Sophie stood up, looking around the quiet house that was now entirely hers. She had done what she needed to do. She had taken her life back, and no one would ever be able to control her again. As she walked through the rooms, feeling the weight of her own strength, Sophie smiled. The future was hers now, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt free. Weeks passed, and Sophie watched as the fallout from her actions unfolded. Emily's career, once thriving, began to crumble slowly. Her boss had called her into an urgent meeting where Sophie's email had been carefully discussed. The truth about Emily's affair with Tom, the betrayal of their friendship, and the financial manipulations she had tried to hide came to light. Sophie had made sure the email contained every detail, making it impossible for Emily to explain her way out of it. Emily's colleagues, many of whom had been close friends, started to distance themselves. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread through the office, and soon, Emily's reputation was shattered. No one could trust her anymore. As Sophie had predicted, Emily had nowhere to hide. The hardest part, though, was watching Tom. After the email, he tried repeatedly to contact Sophie. At first, he had tried the apology route, begging for forgiveness, claiming he had made a mistake and that he still loved her. But Sophie wasn't the woman who would fall for those empty words anymore. She didn't answer his calls. He sent text after text, trying to reason with her, trying to make sense of the mess he had created. Sophie read every message but never responded. She had already made her decision, and nothing Tom said could undo the damage he had done. She had seen his true colors, and no amount of pleading would change that. Then, a few days later, the next wave of repercussions came. Sophie received a call from her lawyer, Kate. The news wasn't surprising, but it was satisfying. Emily had tried to salvage her career by begging for forgiveness, but it was too late. The company had already launched an internal investigation into her behavior, and the damage had already been done. Emily's professional reputation was in tatters, and she would be lucky if she found work in her field again. She had underestimated Sophie, thinking that the affair could stay hidden, that she could continue manipulating people without consequences. Now, Sophie knew Emily was desperate to undo the damage, to somehow make things right. But there was no making things right when Sophie had already exposed the truth. Sophie's heart wasn't filled with anger anymore. It had been replaced with something deeper, something calmer, satisfaction, but also relief. The storm had passed, and she had weathered it all on her own. She had watched Emily and Tom unravel, piece by piece, and in the process, Sophie had rediscovered something she thought she had lost: herself. The woman she was now wasn't the same as the woman who had cried herself to sleep after discovering the affair. She was stronger, more determined. She had learned to take back her power and to never let anyone take it from her again. But there were still a few more loose ends to tie up. Sophie knew she needed closure. She wanted to make sure that Tom understood the finality of their separation, that there was no going back. The phone rang one evening. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. It was Tom. His voice was weak, almost pleading. "Sophie, please. I just need to understand why you're doing this. Why are you making this so hard?" Sophie took a breath, and for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to speak without any emotion clouding her thoughts. "Tom, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because you don't get to walk away from everything you've done and pretend it doesn't matter. You left me for her, and you thought it wouldn't have consequences. But it does. It always does." Tom tried to interrupt, but Sophie continued, her voice steady. "You betrayed me, Tom, and you let Emily do the same. You didn't just leave me. You left the trust, the respect, the partnership we built. And now, you'll have to live with that. There's no more explaining, no more apologies. You made your choice." She paused, allowing the silence to settle between them. "I'm done, Tom. It's over." There was a long pause before Tom finally spoke, his voice almost breaking. "I don't know how I let this happen. I thought it was just a phase. I thought we could fix things." Sophie didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. "Goodbye, Tom," she said, and ended the call. That night, as Sophie sat alone in her living room, her thoughts drifted back to the early days of her marriage, to the moments when she had truly believed in their love. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. The Sophie who had been naive, the one who had believed everything would work out, had been replaced by someone stronger, wiser. And as she looked around the house, her house now, she realized she had gained more than just the property. She had gained her independence, her dignity, and her sense of self. The final chapter of her life with Tom had closed, and a new one was waiting to begin. Sophie knew she wouldn't forget the past, but she also knew that she was no longer a prisoner of it. She was free, and that freedom was worth everything she had gone through. The world was wide open, full of endless possibilities, and Sophie was ready to embrace whatever came next. There was no looking back now. She had learned the hard way that sometimes the best revenge is simply moving forward and making your life better than it ever was before. Sophie spent the next few weeks focused entirely on herself. The weight of the past had been lifted, and she had no desire to revisit it. The house, once filled with reminders of broken promises, now felt like her sanctuary. Every room was a reflection of who she had become: strong, self-sufficient, and in control of her own future. She redecorated, transformed the space into something that felt entirely hers, a symbol of her newfound freedom. The old, familiar sense of their shared life together faded as she introduced new things that brought her joy. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a new beginning that she could be proud of. Sophie made new plans, ones that didn't involve anyone from her old life. She focused on her career, pouring herself into her work in a way she never had before. Her ambition, once pushed aside in favor of her relationship with Tom, now took center stage. She applied for leadership positions, networked with people who valued her skills, and made sure that her future would be shaped by her own hands. Every accomplishment felt like a victory, a step further away from the life she had been forced to leave behind. One evening, Sophie received a message from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It was a simple message. "I heard about everything that happened, and I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. I know you'll come out stronger than ever." It was a small gesture, but it made Sophie smile. It reminded her that, even though she had felt alone in the aftermath of everything, there were people who truly cared about her, people who saw her for who she was, not for the mistakes of the past. As the months went by, Sophie found herself thinking less about Tom and Emily. They had faded into the background of her life, mere echoes of a time when she had allowed herself to be defined by them. She realized she had spent too long letting their actions control her, but now it was her life, her choices, and her path forward. It was a quiet kind of strength, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. Sophie had found peace, not through revenge, but through reclaiming herself. And then, one day, as Sophie walked through a park near her home, something caught her eye. A small handwritten sign for a charity event that was looking for volunteers. The cause was close to her heart, and it felt like the perfect way to give back, to find a sense of purpose in helping others who had faced betrayal and hardship. Sophie signed up that afternoon, excited for the new chapter that was about to unfold. This wasn't about getting revenge anymore. It was about healing, both for herself and for those who needed her. In the end, Sophie had done more than just survive. She had thrived. She had taken the worst moments of her life and turned them into the foundation for a future full of possibilities. As she stood there, looking at the sign, Sophie realized that her journey had brought her to a place where she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She had already proved to herself that she was strong enough to rebuild, and in doing so, had created a life that was truly hers. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie knew that everything was going to be okay.